Most wrestling fans today probably don't know the name Jack Brisco, and that is a real shame. He wasn't famous for wild promos, big catchphrases, or flashy entrances. What he was known for was something even rarer. He was an incredible wrestler. Many legends of the sport believed he was one of the best to ever step into a ring. Don Leo Jonathan once said he might have been the greatest champion of the 20th century. Jack Brisco himself never bragged about any of this. He was a quiet man from a small town in Oklahoma who worked ordinary jobs and stayed humble even when he reached the very top of professional wrestling. This is the story of a forgotten legend and one of the greatest champions the sport has ever seen. Freddie Joe Brisco was born on September 21, 1941, in Blackwell, Oklahoma. Blackwell is a small town in the north-central part of the state. It is the kind of place where everybody knows everybody, where hard work is not just a value, it is a way of life, where toughness is expected and excuses are not tolerated. It was the kind of town that produced a very specific kind of person. Resilient, humble, unbreakable. There is something else about Jack Brisco that shaped his entire identity and worldview. He was of Chickasaw descent, Native American, a proud member of a people with their own rich warrior traditions and cultural heritage. Years later, both Jack and his brother Gerald would be inducted into the Chickasaw Hall of Fame, a recognition that meant as much to them as any wrestling championship ever could. Chickasaw. Growing up in Blackwell, young Freddie Joe discovered two things that would define his life. The first was football. He was good at it, really good, an all-state fullback who had major programs looking at him before he even graduated. The second was wrestling. At wrestling, he was not just good, he was extraordinary. Jack Brisco became a three-time Oklahoma State high school wrestling champion. 3 times. In a state that is arguably the most competitive wrestling state in America. Oklahoma produces elite wrestlers the way Texas produces football players and Indiana produces basketball players. It is in the water, it is in the culture. And to be a 3-time state champion in Oklahoma meant that you were not just talented, you were special. When it came time to choose a college, Brisco had options. He had a football scholarship offer from the University of Oklahoma, no less. A lot of young men from small Oklahoma towns would have jumped at the chance to play football for the Sooners. The money, the exposure, the packed stadiums on Saturday afternoons. It would have been the easy choice. But Jack Brisco did not make the easy choice. He chose wrestling. He turned down the football scholarship and enrolled at Oklahoma State University, one of the premier collegiate wrestling programs in America, and he committed himself entirely to the sport that had defined his youth. At Oklahoma State, Brisco wrestled at 191 pounds. He was a 2-time All-American, which in collegiate wrestling is an enormous achievement. It means you were among the very best in the entire country. Twice. But the crowning achievement came in 1965, when Jack Brisco went undefeated for the entire season and won the NCAA Division I National Championship. He was reportedly the first Native American to ever win the NCAA wrestling title. In a sport dominated at the time by athletes from programs across the Midwest and the East Coast, a Chickasaw kid from Blackwell, Oklahoma had risen to the absolute pinnacle, and he had done it with a style that would become his signature for the rest of his career. Technical brilliance, relentless conditioning, an almost preternatural ability to read his opponent and counter anything they threw at him. But even while all of this was happening, even while he was achieving things that most amateur wrestlers could only dream of, Jack Brisco had his eye on something else entirely, something that had captivated him since childhood. Professional wrestling. Growing up, Brisco had idolized Danny Hodge. If you know anything about the history of amateur and professional wrestling, you know that Danny Hodge is a legend in both worlds. An Olympic silver medalist who became one of the most feared legitimate fighters in professional wrestling history. Hodge was proof that an elite amateur wrestler could transition into the professional ranks and not only survive but thrive. And young Jack Brisco watched Hodge and saw his own future. Hodge had connections to a man named Leroy McGuirk. McGuirk was a fascinating figure in wrestling history. He had been a junior heavyweight champion who went blind in a car accident, yet he continued to operate as a wrestling promoter in the Oklahoma Territory. He ran the Tri-State Territory, which covered Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, and parts of Mississippi. He was always looking for legitimate athletes to bring into the professional game. McGuirk contacted Brisco during his senior year at Oklahoma State. He had been watching. He knew what Brisco could do on the mat. He also knew that a legitimate NCAA champion with Brisco's charisma and athletic ability could be a massive star in the professional ranks. In 1965, Jack Brisco had his first professional wrestling match. His opponent was Ronnie Garvin, and just like that, a career was born. It was the first step into a very different world. Now, breaking into professional wrestling in 1965 was nothing like breaking in today. There was no performance center, and there was no developmental system. In 1965, professional wrestling in America was divided into territories. Regional fiefdoms were controlled by local promoters, all loosely affiliated under the umbrella of the National Wrestling Alliance. Each territory had its own champion, its own stars, its own television show, and its own live event circuit. If you wanted to make it in this business, you had to prove yourself in territory after territory, town after town, match after match. Brisco started in Oklahoma, working for McGuirk's territory for about a year. Then he went to Tennessee to work for Nick Gulas for a few weeks. Then back to Oklahoma, then to Texas, then all the way to Australia. He was learning. Every territory had different styles, different expectations, different audiences. Every territory taught him something new. And Brisco, with his amateur background and his natural intelligence, absorbed it all like a sponge. His first documented championship came on October 16, 1965, when he defeated Don Kent to win the National Wrestling Alliance Missouri Junior Heavyweight Championship. He lost it within a month, and he won it back again in November 1965. It was just the beginning of his professional legacy. Eventually, Brisco made his way to Florida, and this is where everything changed. Championship wrestling from Florida was one of the most important territories in the entire National Wrestling Alliance system. It was a hotbed of talent, a proving ground for future world champions, and it would become Jack Brisco's home base for the most productive years of his career. When Brisco arrived in Florida, he was already an established singles competitor. But something else happened in Florida that would define his career almost as much as any singles championship. His younger brother Gerald had been watching Jack's career with growing fascination, and he wanted in. Jack trained Gerald personally, teaching him the craft of professional wrestling from the ground up. When Gerald was ready, the two brothers began teaming together. The Brisco brothers became one of the most dominant tag teams in National Wrestling Alliance history. They won the National Wrestling Alliance Florida Tag Team Championship an astonishing 10 times. 10 times. They were so good together that their chemistry in the ring became the standard by which all brother tag teams were measured. They moved in sync. They anticipated each other. They had that instinctive connection that only siblings who have grown up together, trained together, and bled together can have. But Jack was never content to be just a tag team wrestler. He continued competing as a singles star with ferocious intensity. He won the National Wrestling Alliance Florida Television Championship multiple times. He won the Southern Heavyweight Championship. He won the National Wrestling Alliance Eastern States Heavyweight Championship while working stints in Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling. Title after title, territory after territory. Jack Brisco was building a resume that was becoming impossible to ignore, and it was impossible to ignore because of what he did inside the ring. Jack Brisco was a pure wrestling machine. In an era when many main event matches relied heavily on brawling, punching, and kicking, Brisco built his matches around actual wrestling: chain wrestling, counter wrestling, submission holds, takedowns, reversals. Sequences that looked like two elite athletes genuinely trying to outmaneuver each other. Because in Brisco's case, that is exactly what was happening. His amateur background gave him a credibility that very few professional wrestlers possessed. When Jack Brisco locked on a hold, you believed it. When he executed a takedown, it looked real because the mechanics were real. He was not pretending to be a wrestler. He was a wrestler. An NCAA champion who happened to be performing in a predetermined format. And that authenticity resonated with audiences in a way that no amount of flashy costumes or dramatic promos could replicate. He was also a natural star. Handsome, athletic, well-built without being cartoonishly muscular. He carried himself with a quiet confidence that told you, before he even locked up with his opponent, that this man was something special. And then came the night that changed everything, July 20th, 1973. On that date, in a match that had been building for months, Jack Brisco defeated Harley Race to win the NWA World Heavyweight Championship. Now the backstory to this moment is worth knowing. Brisco had originally been scheduled to win the title from Dory Funk Jr., capping off their multi-year feud. But Dory said a truck accident had injured him and he missed the scheduled date. The title was awarded to Harley Race as an interim measure, and Brisco won it from Race after a brief reign in Houston, Texas. To understand what this meant, you have to understand what the NWA World Heavyweight Championship was in 1973. This was not one title among many. This was the title. The most prestigious championship in all of professional wrestling. The belt had been held by Thesz, Buddy Rogers, Gene Kiniski, and Dory Funk Jr. The champion was expected to travel from territory to territory, defending the title against the top local star in each region, putting on main event caliber matches night after night. The NWA champion had to be able to work with anyone, in any style, in any territory, and deliver a match worthy of the main event. The NWA Board of Directors, the collection of promoters who controlled the various territories and who voted on who would carry the championship, looked at the landscape of professional wrestling in 1973 and decided that Jack Brisco was the man. That tells you everything you need to know about how his peers viewed him. These were hard-nosed businessmen. They did not give the world championship to someone because he was a nice guy. They gave it to the man who could draw money, deliver in the ring, and represent the championship with dignity and credibility in every territory he visited. Jack Brisco did all of that and more. He held the NWA World Heavyweight Championship for over a year during his first reign. Think about the physical toll of that. Night after night, city after city, territory after territory, long drives, short sleep, different opponents every night, each one trying to prove that he could hang with the world champion. And Brisco delivered every single night. In December 1974, Brisco lost the championship to Giant Baba in Japan. This was significant because it demonstrated the international reach of the NWA title and the respect that Brisco commanded on a global stage. But the loss was short-lived. Just 1 week later, Brisco regained the championship, beginning his second reign as NWA World Heavyweight Champion. He held the title for another year before finally dropping it to Terry Funk in December of 1975. And that match, that rivalry, that moment was part of one of the greatest feuds in wrestling history. The Brisco brothers versus the Funk brothers. Jack and Gerald Brisco against Terry and Dory Funk Jr. Two sets of brothers, two wrestling dynasties. Two families who represented different territories, different styles, different philosophies of what professional wrestling could and should be. Their rivalry raged across multiple territories for nearly a decade. It produced matches that are still talked about today with reverence and awe. Jack Brisco's 1974 match against Dory Funk Jr. was named the Pro Wrestling Illustrated Match of the Year. And in 1972, Brisco was named the most popular wrestler of the year by the same publication. These were not participation trophies. These were recognitions earned through excellence, consistency, and an ability to connect with audiences on a level that very few wrestlers have ever achieved. After his World Championship reigns, Brisco continued to be a major force in professional wrestling throughout the late 1970s and into the 1980s. He and Gerald continued their dominant tag team run, winning championships in Florida, Georgia, and eventually capturing the NWA World Tag Team Championship from Ricky Steamboat and Jay Youngblood in June of 1983. They would hold those titles on 3 separate occasions over the next year. But Brisco's impact on professional wrestling extended far beyond his own matches and championships. In the late 1970s, while touring the Florida territory regularly, Jack and Gerald Brisco, along with wrestler Mike Graham, made a discovery that would change the wrestling business forever. They were in a bar in Florida. The exact details of the discovery story vary depending on who tells it. Some accounts say the Briscoes spotted him playing bass guitar in a band. Others say they noticed him in the crowd at Tuesday night wrestling shows at the Tampa Armory. What everyone agrees on is that the Briscoes saw an enormous man, blonde hair, muscles on top of muscles, the kind of physical specimen that made you stop and stare. And they had the same thought: that guy should be a wrestler. They approached him, they talked to him, they convinced him over the course of several conversations to give professional wrestling a try. Then they introduced him to Hiro Matsuda, one of the most respected and most feared trainers in the business, a man known for his brutally demanding training methods. According to Hogan himself, Matsuda broke his shin bone early in his training, snapping it to see if this long-haired musician had the guts to come back and try again. He came back. 4 months later, with his hair cut short and his resolve hardened, Terry Bollea walked back into Matsuda's gym. And this time he stayed. That young bass player's name was Terry Bollea, and the world would come to know him as Hulk Hogan. Let that sink in for a moment. Without Jack and Gerald Brisco walking into that bar on that particular night and seeing the potential in that particular musician, the entire history of professional wrestling as we know it might be completely different. No Hulkamania, no WrestleMania, no rock and wrestling connection, no national expansion. The wrestling world that exists today, for better or worse, exists in large part because Jack Brisco had an eye for talent and the willingness to act on it. But the Briscoes' behind-the-scenes influence did not stop there. In the early 1980s, Jack and Gerald held stakes in the Georgia Championship Wrestling territory alongside promoter Jim Barnett and booker Ole Anderson. Georgia Championship Wrestling was significant because it had a national cable television slot on Ted Turner's WTBS Superstation. That time slot made Georgia Championship Wrestling one of the most visible wrestling promotions in the country. In 1984, dissatisfied with the direction of the company, the Briscoes convinced fellow shareholder Paul Jones to give them proxy voting rights on his shares. Combined with Jim Barnett's stake, they had enough to sell to Vince McMahon Jr. for $900,000. This was one of the most consequential business transactions in wrestling history. McMahon took over the Georgia Championship Wrestling time slot on WTBS and replaced Georgia Championship Wrestling with his World Wrestling Federation product. This event became known as Black Saturday, and it sent shockwaves through the entire wrestling industry. The ramifications were enormous. Ted Turner was furious. The fans who had been watching Georgia Championship Wrestling were furious. The entire NWA system was shaken to its core. Eventually, the fallout from Black Saturday led to Vince McMahon selling the time slot to Jim Crockett Promotions for a significant sum of money. Some have argued that this influx of cash helped fund the very first WrestleMania, though the exact financial trail has been debated for decades. And the initial rift between Ted Turner and Vince McMahon that was created by Black Saturday eventually blossomed into a full-scale war. A war that would culminate years later in the Monday Night Wars between the World Wrestling Federation and WCW. A war that would define professional wrestling for an entire generation. All of it traces back, at least in part, to the Brisco brothers and their decision to sell their stake in Georgia Championship Wrestling. By 1984, Jack Brisco was 43 years old. He had been wrestling professionally for nearly 2 decades. His body had absorbed the punishment of thousands of matches across dozens of territories and multiple countries, and he was starting to feel it. His last high-profile match came on December 28, 1984, when he and Gerald challenged the North-South connection of Adrian Adonis and Dick Murdoch for the World Wrestling Federation Tag Team Championship at Madison Square Garden. The match ended in a double countout. And then, not long after that, came the moment that defined how Jack Brisco would leave the business. He was in Newark, New Jersey. It was winter. A fierce snowstorm had descended on the city, and Brisco found himself standing outside, unable to feel his face or his hands, waiting to go perform in a building that was probably half empty because of the weather. And in that moment, standing in that freezing storm, something clicked. He was done. He cancelled his future bookings. He caught the next plane south, and he never came back. He later explained that he felt himself slowing down. His mind was still sharp. He still knew what to do and when to do it. But his body was starting to lag behind what his mind was telling it, and that was something he could not accept. He never wanted to overstay his ability. He never wanted to be the guy who hung on too long, who embarrassed himself, who tarnished the legacy he had worked so hard to build. He was also, by his own admission, disillusioned with what the wrestling business was becoming. He saw fewer amateur wrestlers making it into the professional ranks. He saw the growing reliance on soap opera storylines and cartoonish characters. And he decided he wanted no part of it. In February of 1985, Jack Brisco walked away from professional wrestling. He was 43 years old, and unlike so many wrestlers before and after him, he stayed away. He did not come back for one more run. He did not chase one more payday. He did not try to recapture past glory. He made a clean break, and he stuck to it. After leaving the ring, Brisco settled in Florida with his wife Jan, who would be his partner for over 30 years. Together with his brothers Gerald and Bill, he opened the Brisco Brothers Body Shop, an auto body repair business that they would operate for more than 3 decades. He lived quietly. He did not seek the spotlight. He was grateful for everything the wrestling business had given him, the opportunity to travel the world, to perform at the highest level, to be part of a brotherhood that few outsiders could ever understand. But he was also content to leave it behind and live a normal life. There were occasional appearances. He showed up at Florida's Wrestle Reunion event in January of 2005, meeting fans and reconnecting with old friends and rivals. And the honors continued to accumulate even in retirement. In 2005, Brisco was inducted into the Professional Wrestling Hall of Fame as part of the television era wing. It was a recognition of his contribution to wrestling during the period when television was transforming the business from a regional attraction into a national phenomenon. In 2008, the Brisco brothers received perhaps the greatest honor of all. They were inducted into the WWE Hall of Fame. The induction was handled by John Bradshaw Layfield, a proud Texan who put aside any Oklahoma-Texas rivalry for one night to honor 2 men he deeply respected. It was a moment that brought together past and present, acknowledging the foundation upon which the modern wrestling business was built. Jack and Gerald were also inducted into the NWA Hall of Fame in 2010 and the St. Louis Wrestling Hall of Fame in 2008. And of course, there was the Chickasaw Hall of Fame, a recognition of their heritage and their contribution to their people's legacy. Ric Flair, who many consider the greatest professional wrestler of all time, frequently cited Jack Brisco as one of the great wrestlers of the 1970s. Flair was never shy about giving credit where it was due, and whenever he cut one of his famous emotional promos, Brisco's name would come up. Because Flair understood. He understood what Brisco meant to the business. He understood the standard that Brisco had set. And he understood that without men like Jack Brisco, men like Ric Flair would never have had the platform to become what they became. Pro wrestling historian Bob Roop, himself a Greco-Roman wrestler at the 1968 Summer Olympics, recalled meeting Brisco when he first broke into the Florida territory in the early 1970s. Roop said that Brisco was Florida's star babyface, an experienced hand, and that having Brisco treat a newcomer like himself as a peer was especially gratifying. Roop had come into the business with the attitude that newcomers had dues to pay, and deserved no special treatment from the veterans. So having Brisco treat him as an equal from day one was something that stayed with him forever. That was who Jack Brisco was. A man who did not need to remind you of his status. A man who treated people with respect, regardless of where they stood on the card. A man who was happy for other people's success and never seemed threatened by anyone else's accomplishments. In a business notorious for enormous egos and backstage politics, Brisco was an anomaly. A genuinely good man in a world that did not always reward goodness. The final years of Jack Brisco's life were not easy. He suffered from bouts of pneumonia. His back, ravaged by decades of absorbing punishment in the ring, gave him constant trouble. He had been a heavy smoker for much of his life, and the toll of that habit was catching up with him. On February 1st, 2010, Jack Brisco passed away at the age of 68. The cause was complications from open-heart surgery. At the time of his death, he was being cared for by his friend Bugsy McGraw, a fellow retired wrestler who had become a nurse. There is something poignant about that detail. Even at the end, even in his most vulnerable moments, Brisco was surrounded by the brotherhood. The wrestling fraternity that he had dedicated his life to was there for him when he needed it most. He was survived by Jan, his wife of more than 30 years, the woman who had been by his side through the glory years, the quiet years, and the difficult final years. The tributes that poured in after his death told the story of a man who was loved and respected by virtually everyone who had ever crossed his path. Respected for his ability, certainly, but even more so for who he was as a human being, for his humility, for his integrity, for his unwillingness to compromise the values instilled in him growing up in that small Oklahoma town. When you look at Jack Brisco's career in totality, the numbers alone are staggering. 2-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion, 3-time NWA World Tag Team Champion with Gerald, 10-time NWA Florida Tag Team Champion, multiple reigns with the Southern Heavyweight Championship, the NWA Florida Television Championship, the NWA Eastern States Heavyweight Championship, the Mid-Atlantic Heavyweight Championship, and the NWA Missouri Championship. Over 20 different titles across multiple territories and continents. But the numbers only tell part of the story. They do not capture what it was like to watch Jack Brisco wrestle, the fluidity of his movement, the intelligence of his ring work, the way he could take a crowd on a journey, building a match from a slow, technical opening through escalating drama to a crescendo that had thousands of people on their feet. The way he made you believe. There is a reason that wrestling fans who were around during the 1970s speak about Jack Brisco with a kind of reverence that borders on devotion. There is a reason veteran wrestlers consistently rate him as a 10 out of 10, as one of the absolute greatest to ever do it. The quality of the work transcends any particular era or style. Jack Brisco was the last of the old school. He was the last NWA World Champion who was a pure babyface, a clean-cut, technically brilliant hero who relied on his wrestling ability rather than gimmicks, catchphrases, or outrageous behavior to get over with the fans. After Brisco, the NWA Championship would be defined by characters like Harley Race and Ric Flair, men who were brilliant in their own right, but who represented a different kind of champion, a more complex, morally ambiguous kind of champion. Brisco was the end of an era, the last man standing from a time when being the best wrestler in the room was enough. And maybe that is why his legacy has faded somewhat in the decades since his retirement. The business moved on. It moved towards spectacle and entertainment and larger-than-life characters. It moved toward a world where promo skills mattered more than wrestling ability, where the sizzle became more important than the steak. Jack Brisco was all steak. In a business that increasingly demanded sizzle, that meant his contributions were sometimes overlooked by newer fans who had no frame of reference for what wrestling used to be. Here is the beautiful irony. The man who walked away from the business because he was disillusioned with its direction, the man who felt that soap opera storylines and cartoon characters were ruining the art form he loved, is directly responsible for the single biggest cartoon character in wrestling history, Hulk Hogan. The man who embodied everything Brisco felt was wrong with the modern product was discovered by Brisco himself. There is a lesson in there somewhere, something about the way life refuses to follow the scripts we write for it. Something about the way our greatest contributions are sometimes the ones we never intended to make. But regardless of what professional wrestling became after he left, regardless of how the business evolved or devolved depending on your perspective, the facts of Jack Brisco's career remain. The championships, the matches, the respect of his peers, the admiration of the fans who were fortunate enough to see him perform, the acknowledgement from the greatest wrestlers of the 20th century that he belonged in their company. Championships and respect are part of his record. Jack Brisco never asked for that kind of recognition, he never campaigned for it, and he never politicked for it. He just went out there, night after night, territory after territory, year after year, and he wrestled. He wrestled with everything he had, with the skill of an NCAA champion, the heart of a warrior, and the humility of a man who never forgot the coal mines, the carpentry jobs, and the janitor's mop. And when it was over, when his body told him it was time, he walked away with his head held high and his dignity intact. He went home to Florida. He went home to Jan. He opened his body shop. He lived his life, and he never looked back. That is the story of Jack Brisco. A man who was born with nothing in a small town in Oklahoma, who became a 3-time state champion, an NCAA national champion, and a 2-time NWA World Heavyweight Champion. A man who discovered Hulk Hogan and inadvertently helped create WrestleMania and the Monday Night Wars. A man who held over 20 championships across multiple continents. A man who was honored by every major Hall of Fame in the business. His was a quiet, durable legacy. At the end of the day, he was simply happy to be part of the group. The wrestling business does not always treat its legends well. Too many end up broken, bitter, forgotten. Too many die alone and penniless, casualties of a business that chews people up and spits them out. Jack Brisco was different. He left on his own terms. He built a life after wrestling. He had a loving wife, a successful business, and the respect of everyone who ever knew him. When the end came, he was surrounded by people who cared about him. In a business full of larger-than-life stories, Jack Brisco's might be the most remarkable of all. Not because of the drama, not because of the spectacle, but because of the quiet, steady dignity of a man who knew exactly who he was, and who let his work speak for itself. They do not make them like Jack Brisco anymore. Wrestling is poorer for it. Like and subscribe for more wrestling history. Until next time.